Hi and welcome back to the Crafty Whisk. Ollie here. Today I'm making a monochromatic white card with a touch of silver on there. Very, very pretty. And there's quite a few techniques in this one, so let's jump into it. I'm going to be using a cover panel from Reverse Confetti called Double Stitch Window, and just a generic stamp with some writing on there, and etched crocus stems from Simon Says Stamp, a hot foil plate from Reverse Confetti called Birthday Wishes, and a herringbone embossing folder from Doris. Now the Reverse Confetti stuff can't get any more, they've closed down, but there's plenty of other companies that have the similar thing. And I'm also using a spray from Cadence called Shake and Gilt in multicolour. Now all of my cardstock I tend to cut it down straight away into 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So with these cover panels, it's already the right size. So I just slip it into where the dies are and run it through the machine. Now I forgot with this particular die that it doesn't actually cut very well. I forgot to put a shim over it. That would have solved that problem, but that's what craft knives are for. Very handy just to fix up little boo-boos like this. I can't get another one exactly the same because Reverse Confetti, unfortunately, very sadly, closed earlier this year. Or was it late last year? I can't remember. But I have a lot of their stuff, so unfortunately you will be seeing me use their stuff, but you can get comparable things elsewhere. I'm going to be using craft foam today for my dimension. It's just easier to go through the post. It's more stable than using foam strips because it's just all one layer. You can also just use a multiple pieces of cardstock behind there. If you've got like cards that didn't work out, don't throw them away because you can use them as dimension. So with the craft foam, I have tried die cutting it. In the past, it tends to squish, so it does get a little bit warped. I don't know if it's just the craft foam we have here in Australia that's different, but it does not die cut very well. So I just do the best I can with just the trimmer. Luckily, it's just a rectangle and a square today, so it's nice and easy. So to gauge where I need to cut that center window out, I just grab a pen and just put a dot in the corners, being very careful not to touch the white cardstock. And then what I do is just grab a metal edged ruler and with my knife again, just cut out that square, but I cut a little bit further than where I've done the dots, just in case it gets squished or I didn't want to see any foam. I didn't want to run the risk of seeing foam through that window. So it's pretty much just 1/8 of an inch, or maybe even just 1/16. It's just a tiny little bit bigger than the square that the die cut for me. And craft foam is so cheap. And you can get it in all sorts of different colours. I predominantly will use white. Occasionally I use black, but they're probably the only two that I tend to use. Now before I attach or adhere this to my front panel, I want to emboss my front panel. I'm just checking to make sure that I did it correctly and that I've got that little bit of leeway with that square window. Now normally you would squirt or just with a very fine mist spray the back of your cardstock or run a baby wipe over the back of it. I'm only using 80-pound cardstock, so I knew it wouldn't crack with this particular embossing folder. Now the sandwich I use to run through the machine varies from embossing folder to embossing folder. So it's a good idea to swatch out all of your embossing folders and write down on the swatch what sandwich you used. Sometimes you need a shim, sometimes you don't. Sometimes that blue plate is too thick and you can just use your normal cutting plate. It really does depend, so you have a play. Now, I actually want this to be a layered card, so I'm trimming off 1/8 of an inch all the way around so that I end up with a 4 inches by 5 1/4. And because it is symmetrical in design, I need to do it from all 4 sides, 1/8 of an inch all the way around the sides. So now we're coming to use the etched crocus from Simon Says Stamp. And again, I'm using Neenah cardstock throughout this video because I wanted everything to be the same white. And I'm sure you've come to realize that no white is the same. Who knew there were so many variations with white? So I tend to have both 80 pound and as close to 110 pound as I can get in various brands, because different cardstocks are good for different techniques. Like foiling, for example, I have used Neenah, but there is other cardstocks that are better to foil on. There's cardstocks that you use your Copic markers on that are better, all that sort of thing. Now, to add a little bit of dimension to the flowers, I'm just using a squishy foam base. I think it came in packaging. And I'm using the lid of one of my pens because it is rounded. By all means, if you've got a ball tool, use a ball tool. I do have ball tools, but this is about using what you already have, so you don't have to buy fancy things. And if the lid of the pen is rounded, use it. And I only want a little bit of dimension. I'm not making them into the perfect kind of flower. I just wanted there to be just that little bit. Now, when I laid them on my card, I felt it was too white. That sounds weird because it's a monochromatic card, but here I'm just adding COO and CO with my Copic markers. So I'm laying down the C0 and blending out with the C00. It's a very, very pale grey. So I'm just hinting at a little bit of depth and shadow to the flowers without actually adding a colour per se. I know it sounds weird, but it does make a difference. And you'll find that the backing crocuses, there's 2 different sizes as well as 2 different sizes of crocus stem. So they sort of, the small one goes to the small crocus, the large one goes to the large crocus. Now, I've just got my little splat box and I thought, oh, hang on, I'm doing foiling. I better plug my foiling machine in because it takes a little while to warm up. Now, I have the Go Press and Foil because here in Australia, we don't have much of an option with different brands because they come with different plugs and then there's no warranty because you're using a converter, all that kind of rubbish. But the Go Press and Foil is our go-to machine here in Australia. So I haven't got another machine to compare it with to tell you which one's better because I've only ever used this one. So in my spray box, which is basically something I got a kit in ages ago, I'm just spraying the Cadence spray over the flowers and then letting them dry. So now I'm just getting my card base ready to go. So scoring it in half so that I end up with your traditional 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 card base. And it's all about depth. With the monochromatic cards, you can add depth really easily and add interest very easily. So I'm just using the contour ink from Hero Arts because it's actually an ink you're meant to do colouring where you don't see the image. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but you don't actually see the ink very well at all. It blends into the card and it's perfect for what I'm doing here. So I've just popped the panel on so I know where I want the stamp and then put the stamp down, pick the stamp up with the lid and then take the panel away. And now I just stamp it onto my card base. I'm stamping it twice and this is only going to add a hint of depth, a hint of colour to the card. You won't even really notice it unless you look for it, but your brain picks all this up anyway. So it's sort of a trick, I suppose you could call it. So now we come to assembling parts of it. I found with the craft foam, double-sided tape just doesn't work very well. So I'm just using liquid glue in my little bottle. I cannot tell you, I can't remember which one I used, if it was the Barely Art or if it was the Art glitter glue. I can't remember. I've got little bottles for all of the brands as well. It was the first thing I laid my hands onto. All of the main brands work fine. So I'm just adding some weight down onto the foam to make sure that the glue adheres to the paper, because it tends to sink into the foam a little bit. So while that is setting, I'm going to hot foil my little sentiment, and I'm using it is silver iridescent foil from the Go Preston foil, and I thought this silver would be nice because it kind of gives the illusion that it's almost like white. And I didn't think it really mattered too much having silver on a white card. If I had gold, that's a different story altogether. You don't do that. So I'm just using, I've got a Cricut machine, so I'm just using the little rotary cutter that I got for the Cricut machine. I find it much easier to cut foil with that than with scissors because it's so thin. It tends to slip around a little bit with the scissors. So I'm just warming up my foil plate. And waiting for that little light to change. So I'm going to get my cardstock ready. Again, it is 80 pound Nina. It's not the most ideal cardstock to use with foiling, but it's only a sentiment, so it doesn't really matter. And I'm just using my little dusting brush to make sure there is no dust particles, because that can hamper how your foiling turns out. So it is pretty side to pretty side. You put the colour of the foil down against the hot foil plate. So your cardstock is basically going to be laying on top of the back of the foil. Very different, or it's the opposite with toner foils. Now I know with this one I need a shim to run through my machine, so I've just popped a piece of cardstock on the top. Once that is ready to go, you run it through your machine quite, I wouldn't say vigorously, but sort of slowly. Now you need to let it cool down a little bit before you reveal it. And I'm just using a little magnet tool I got from Spellbinders to pick up the hot foil plate because yeah, I value my fingertips and it is quite hot. So once that is cooled down, I can give the reveal. So it doesn't take long to cool down at all. It always amazes me how well the foiling works. If you do get little bits of foil where you don't want them, just use a quite a firm bristle of paintbrush, or you can just wrap some washi tape around your fingers and take it off with washi tape. It'll only take off the foil that's not meant to be there. So this particular one, a sentiment, comes with the outline die as well. So I'll be using that, and I wanted to create some layers again with this one. So I'm also cutting 2 more layers of the shadow. So I'll cut the sentiment out first, and then I'll cut the 2 shadows. An appearance from Miss Nala today. And I'm just sort of speeding this bit up a bit because you don't need to see me running it through the die machine all the time. This little die machine is a godsend. It's from Heffy Doodle and it is so easy to use. It hasn't skipped a beat and it's a good price point too. And they're a UK company. So for us here in Australia, the shipping is fantastic. It's very quick. And it just folds up and sits next to me on my table. I will be adhering these using liquid glue just because it's so fiddly. And then once I've adhered them, I'll be putting a weight on them. Now, the paperweight that I'm using isn't actually a paperweight. I just went into one of our Salvation Army stores, like a thrift store sort of thing, and it's meant to be a single rose vase, but it's really cool as a paperweight. So that's what I use it as. It's heavy, it's see-through, so you can actually see what's underneath. Now with the flowers, I did want the flowers to have dimension, so I'm just popping a foam square on the single, the back, the petal, and I'm going to adhere the front of the flower to the back using that foam square and a touch of liquid glue just on the side so that the flower closes up. Because I'm only using the single colour, I felt this was a necessary step. If you're using, of course, different colours or different shades of the same colour, you don't necessarily have to do this step at all because you have the colour variation, so you can create depth through colour. Here I had to create depth using dimensionals. And just a word of warning with this die cutting set, the stems are extremely fragile. They're so thin. And then because I went and sprayed them as well, it actually made them more fragile. You'd think it would be the opposite, but they actually became more fragile. So with the technique that I'm using them for today, it didn't matter. But just bear that in mind if they're going to be a focal point on the front of a card. I'm actually going to be layering them and then popping the cover panel over the top. So all we're seeing is the top, probably third to half of the flowers. So it's easy enough for me to attach the stems accordingly. And you don't want a whole heap of glue spilling out either. So when you pop the glue on the stem, just run your finger over it so that you're taking off anything that might seep out the sides. And I've got the cover plate, or the top layer of the card just sitting loosely on top so that I can place the flowers where I want them to be. And then once everything is in place with the flowers, then I can attach that cover plate down. And don't be afraid to cut up your dies. There will be instances like in this case, the stems are too long, so I trim them down so we're not wasting everything underneath, and we're also not causing bulk underneath the cover panel. And when you've got flowers that have been badly damaged, like this one, I just cut the entire stem off and then I trim the stem down to where the paper is still really good. It's not damaged at all. And then I apply it from there. It might mean that I've got to cut the leaves off, which I do, because they're going to be not quite where I want them to sit. But that's okay, because once you've put the front panel on the card, if there's any gaps, that's where you can pop those leaves. Leaves are really good fillers, really good. They're also really handy for covering up mistakes. And tweezers or reverse tweezers actually are really good as a third hand. because it enables you to still hold on to something and stick it down without getting your fingers in the way too much. I have that problem a lot. I end up with very gluey fingers. I'm sure some of you can empathise with me there with the gluey fingers and glue seeping out where you don't want it to seep out. That's why I love these little bottles. They have such a fine nozzle on them. It really makes life easier for applying glue. And I just decant my larger bottles of glue into the smaller bottles. So I have a few of these small bottles depending on which brand I'm using. I've got one for Barely Art, I've got one for Gina K, and Art Glitter Glue. So now I'm applying a liberal amount of liquid glue on the fun foam, because remember the fun foam does absorb a little bit of the glue. So we need to apply a reasonable amount, and then we also need to apply a bit of pressure to make sure that it sticks. So I'm just using my little vase paperweight. I need to get another paperweight actually. Got to look into that. Might go back to the Salvo stores, I think, and see if there's any other little gems in there. So now I'm just applying the leaves in the gaps while I've got the cover plate stuck down there. And I apologise, my head does get in the way a bit, but I needed to see exactly where I was placing it. So we're almost done here. If you're enjoying this video, please click like. And if you haven't subscribed, I would love to have you on board as a subscriber. It helps my little channel grow and helps me to bring new content to you on a regular basis as well. Sort of like encouragement. And comment down below as well if you've made a monochromatic card, if you think this one actually fits the bill of a monochromatic card. I know I've used a touch of silver in there, but I think I can get away with that. And now for the finishing touches, I'm just going to add some clear gems. I bought these from Paper Crafting Australia, but unfortunately she's no longer in business. But this sort of thing you can find pretty much at every major craft supply store, and also have a look in your $2 shops. They quite often have little gems in there and sequins and all sorts of little things. It's worth giving them a try. And I'm just using a little wax pen to maneuver them where I want them to go. You can also, if you don't have a pickup stick such as this, tweezers I find a little bit fiddly for these little gems. You can just use a toothpick with a blob of blue tack on the end. Works just as well. I must admit I do get frustrated with the little pickup sticks. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I've got a few different ones. The one I'm using is not one of my favourite ones, I must say. But I don't know if it's this time of year. It's winter here at the moment. I don't know if that has something to do with it, because it's quite firm. It doesn't actually have a lot of stick to it. That could be something. I don't know. I'll try it in summer, see if it makes any difference. And that is the completed card. Let me know what you think. And I'll catch up with you next time. Bye for now.